Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my image quality breakdown from the new Samyang 85mm F1.4 for Sony FE. I'm actually filming on it at the moment on the Sony A7R Mark III. Now, if you haven't already, I would recommend that you take a look at my first look episode, where I give you a breakdown on the build quality and design, the weather sealing, the handling of the lens. Take a look at that and get a little more information. Today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the image quality and take a look at the different attributes of the lens. At this point, I've reviewed, as probably most of you know, a lot of lenses. And over the years, what I have learned is that there is a certain philosophy that goes into every lens design, where a manufacturer makes decisions about the kind of things that they're going to emphasize. There's no perfect lens out there, so every lens has a certain amount of compromises that are a part of it, where the engineers have prioritized one thing over another. Whether or not they get that right really depends on your personal expectations, because different people value different things. For example, Sigma often emphasizes, in their art lenses, they emphasize sharpness and aberration control, basically over just about everything else. And so some people really there's them because they're incredibly sharp. Other people will complain, and I get feedback saying that they're kind of soulless or they're clinical, and there's something that's missing. It's like they've been engineered in a lab rather than kind of in the emulsion days of analog photography. And so like I said, different strokes for different folks. So today we're going to see how Samyang has done in trying to find that right balance for image quality. So let's jump in and let's take a look to see if they've gotten it right. So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So if we look here on the left side, this is an uncorrected RAW file. There is a bit of corrections that come with JPEGs, and so some in-camera correction, but here we're just dealing with the RAW file as it comes to you. So you can see that there is a mild amount of pincushion distortion. You can see a little bit of a bulge up here in the middle, bit of a bulge down on this line. Probably not enough for you to actually see in any kind of real-world shooting, but it does exist. So here's what I've done to manually correct for vignette. I've added a plus 35 and then moved the midpoint to 11. So what this means is that there is a mild to slightly moderate amount of actual vignette in the corners. Not very heavy, certainly better than a lot of 85mm lenses that I've seen. But what we also see is that the midpoint is fairly far over here. You can see this slider is closer to the edge, and that means that the vignette has crept in a pretty far way into the frame. Now, unfortunately, I don't have another 85mm f1.4 lens on hand. However, I do own the Tamron 85mm f1.8, which, if you have watched my 85mm comparisons in the past, you've seen me compare it to other 85mm lenses, including the Sigma 85mm f1.4 Art, the Canon 85mm f1.4 LIS, and even the Zeiss Otis 85mm f1.4. And so you can have seen from that while it only has a maximum aperture of f1.8, it is a professional grade lens. It has image quality that is in the same ballpark as all of these lenses. So what we can see here is that the Tamron presents a little bit brighter here, but of course the difference is we've got twice the shutter speed and only 2/3 of a stop difference in aperture. And so typically these Samyang lenses have had very good light transmission, and I think that that's probably the case here as well. If we look in the center of the frame, what we can see is that at f1.4 compared to f1.8, that the Samyang is perhaps a little bit sharper with a little bit more contrast at the edge of the frame, which is quite remarkable. Off towards the edge of the frame, the lenses look to be fairly equal, which again is very impressive for an f1.4 lens. And so what you can see is that the sharpness profile from the Samyang, it actually extends right out to the edges of the frame. It does really quite a good job of maintaining sharpness. And what we can also see is that centering is also quite good. Now on this side, it looks like the Tamron is a little bit sharper at f1.8 at the edge. We'll go apples to apples here. So you can see that at f1.8, it's delivering a 1/4000th of a second versus a 3,200th of a second shutter speed. And so we can see again, light transmission is quite good on the Samyang. And so taking a look in the center of the frame, we can definitely see that the Samyang is sharper at f1.8 at the center of the frame and has better contrast. There's just no question about that. We move off to the left side of the frame. This is where the Tamron has been strongest, and it still looks to be a hair stronger at the edge of the frame. On the right side, the Samyang looks, basically as good, if not even a hair better. With both lenses at f2, the Samyang is definitely sharper in the center of the frame. You're seeing really superb sharpness and contrast. Moving off to the side of the frame, not terribly different between the two. Both of them looking really, really excellent along the edge of the frame as well. On the left side, Tamron might still have a very slight edge, but it's not by much. Now, I will also note here that the Tamron has framed a little bit tighter than other 85mm lenses, and so it's not by much here in this comparison, but I do think that the Tamron is framing a little bit tighter. You can see here at the very edge of the frame that it seems a little bit tighter on that side, but we'll see a little bit on this side. So I would say that the Samyang, I would say that the Tamron from my previous test is somewhere around 86mm, so this is probably very close to 85mm. Now you can see at f2.8 that the Samyang is now stunningly sharp in the center of the frame. Just incredible contrast, lots and lots of resolution. Definitely outperforms center of the frame compared to the Tamron. Now at f2.8, it also looks, at least on this right side, it looks better than what the Tamron does in terms of the, particularly the contrast and resolution, like in this section mid-frame. And even moving down towards the corners, I would say it looks stronger. Over here where the Tamron has been the stronger lens, they're now, to me, they look roughly equal on this side. If there's any advantage for the Tamron, and there is a little bit in here, I think it's very, very minor. And so both of them very, very sharp at f2.8, but the Samyang impressively so, particularly in the center of the frame. So we can see, comparing f2.8 to f4, that in the center of the frame, there's really no extra resolution to be found. By stopping down further, here on the edge of the frame, there might be a hair more, but I don't know if it's enough to be detectable in real world. Maybe a little bit here, but I would say that, you're already by f2.8 getting pretty close to perfect across the frame. Here at f5.6, we see just a little bit more resolution in the corner, and so that's probably your peak landscape aperture is f5.6. Incredibly sharp here, even out in the very corner of the frame. Now, I've noticed a progression with the Samyang AF lenses for how well they're controlling aberrations. And so you can see the first that I reviewed was the AF 50mm. You can see that there is some really strong fringing that's along here, and definitely fringing all of the highlights. You can see with the 35mm that it's definitely less pronounced and the contrast is up, and so there was an improvement when it came to the actual aberration control there. We're going to see a further progression of that here. So looking now at the 85mm, you can see that, as we look into like the bokeh, like the fringing on the bokeh, it's definitely better controlled without any of that green lining here on the 85mm. And so it's our winner so far when it comes to controlling aberrations. And even in these kind of bright reflections here, there's just a little tiny bit of fringing, not very strongly pronounced there. Now, just taking a quick look at the geometric deformation, you can see that towards the edge of the frame there is a little bit of a cat eye effect. Stop down to f2, however, what you can see is you've got pretty nice circular shapes really all across the frame. And so if that's kind of a big deal to you, shoot at f2, and that's going to give you a really nice performance in that metric. Just taking a quick look at these bokeh circles, you can see that there really is not any particular hard edges. We've already noted no fringing to them. And so, some of these lack of an inner line, this is good signs for having nice, soft bokeh rendering. So let's look a little bit further for those longitudinal chromatic aberrations, the green and the purple fringing. And what we can see is there's a tiny bit you can see in some of these really high contrast areas at f1.4. On the right side, what you can see is I have just done the eyedropper correction here in Lightroom, which has done a really clean job of correcting for that. So you can see that, aberrations are mild and certainly correctable. Now, the good thing about longitudinal chromatic aberration is that stopping down does help to eliminate them. And so you can see on the right side at f2.8, they're virtually non-existent. And the byproduct of that is that even right off to the edge of the frame, you can see how that contrast and sharpness has improved as a result of that clearing up. Here at f2, obviously we're shooting against a very high contrast towards a very light background. But the good news is this is at f2. You can see that aberrations are actually really well controlled. And so byproduct of that is you've got really nice detail and a nice crisp, delineation of edges without a lot of bleeding. Two things I want to show you from the scene. First of all, stop down to f5.6, kind of a landscape type aperture. We can see if we look at a pixel level, this is on a Sony a7R Mark III, tons of resolution and detail. There's an incredible amount of textures there. And you can see that in all of this, it's really done a great job with good contrast in those textures. What we can see as we move off to the side is that there is a little bit of lateral chromatic aberration. Again, this is not highly pronounced, and this is the kind you can correct with one click. And this is probably the worst case scenario with bright snow, high contrast towards the edge of the frame. But I do see a little bit of lateral chromatic aberrations towards the edge of the frame. Again, not hard to correct for, but just pointing them out. Now, some of you have written me with concerns about really bad flare performance from this lens. I haven't personally seen it myself. This is kind of the worst case scenario I've seen thus far. So, obviously contrast has held up good. We've got a little bit of a ghosting artifact here with the lens stopped down.
Samyang 85mm F1.4. This is stopped down to f11 flare resistance.
Now, in more controlled lighting conditions, this is indoor without such harsh, kind of lighting. Here at f1.4, you can see that we really don't have any kind of actual aberration issues. I'm not really concerned with chromatic aberrations on this lens at all. We can see lots of detail, and even in this contrast to bright fur, an area, I don't see anything to be concerned about there. So here we go at f1.4, and then at f2, this is essentially minimum focus here. And so a couple of things we'll look for chromatic aberrations. You can see a tiny bit of purple there and a little bit of green in the lettering there. We can see that at f2 that the purple is basically eliminated, just a little bit of the green that is left there. And so we do have an uptick in the contrast that comes out of that. Also the bokeh here, you can see the aperture shape. So again, a little bit of deformation, but not terrible really towards edge of the frame. The cat eye effect is not strongly pronounced. But unlike some lenses at f2, you actually do have a really nice circular shape with the lens stopped down. Now, stopping on down to f2.8, we can see we still have good circular shape. However, what we are starting to see is just a little bit of the aperture blade. There are 9 aperture blades, so a little bit of a nonagonal shape, but frankly, not really all that bad. The circular impression is still there quite good. And if we take a look at kind of our, our main subject here, you can see, look at how much detail is there in that made in Taiwan. Just really great information that's there across the frame. Look how sharp it is down here, even right into the very corner. Now, I think the trade-off for not trying to correct away every bit of aberration is that while we have, really good sharpness here, I'm delighted with the detail and the chromatic aberration control there. But looking at the rest of the image, look at how soft and creamy, very nice that bokeh is. No hard edges. It really melts away very nicely. And so I'm really pleased with that. Here's another image also at f1.4, and it shows that really nice balance. So, we've got a tiny little depth of field here, but on this leaf that I focused on, this is a handheld image. you know, very crisp edges, you know, lots of detail for f1.4, and then, you know, a very, very soft background. And this is even with, you know, in the forest right now, everything is bare, just branches, but you can see that it really has, you know, bled away quite softly. So let's take a look at how this breaks down for portraiture. So this is under obviously controlled lighting. I'm using the single Rotolight EOS light that I reviewed not long ago. This is at f2.8. I was actually activating the camera remotely using the app. And so in that case, the Sony app's a little primitive. You don't get to actually choose your selection, you know, your focus point. You can't move that around. And so I was having to trust, you know, it to actually nail the eye. And as you can see, it did a really, really great job of that. I mean, at f2.8, there's huge amounts of detail around the eyes, much more skin information than what most 40-year-old men, I'm going to be 43 in a few months. This is not really what we want to show off of our faces, but anyway, there it is in all of its glory. So, I mean, obviously no lack of information there, but you can also see that skin texture looks good. It doesn't look plasticky. It's a really nice balance there when it comes to that. Even at f1.4, we can see that obviously depth of field at this distance is tiny shallow. So you can see that in this case it got the eye, but the eyelashes are in focus and the eyeball is not. I mean, that's how shallow the depth of field is. But what you can see is that with a little bit of processing, I mean, obviously you can punch up the amount of contrast to the desired effect. I've layered in an overlay here. And so just to add nuance to it all, you can see that you can very credibly shoot even at f1.4. If you're looking for a certain look, just note you're going to have a lot that is out of focus when you're shooting like that. Moving back a little bit further, this is about 8 feet away. And so at f1.4, depth of field is a little bit deeper now, but you can see once again focus has nailed the eye, and you know there's lots of information to work with when it comes to that. And so, you know, once again doing a really great job of eye detecting and nailing focus. So in this case, once again, we've got f1.4. This is outside. I'm using a single MET64AF1 flash unit, but triggered remotely. And so I've got an assistant holding the light off to the side. And so what you can see is once again at f1.4, plenty of detail and information that's there. And particularly on the right side, after I've done processing and I actually downsample it a bit because, you know, the file is huge out of the A7R Mark III, you can see that there's tons of detail and contrast there. And so I'm able to dial in, you know, selectively more contrast kind of to taste, but we can retain a really, really soft defocused background. And so I'm really impressed by that. This is an available light f1.4 portrait with basically no real post-processing to it. And what you can see is that, you know, once again, IAF has worked perfectly. Everything is focused and in detail. Just, I mean, there's lots of information there and a really nice three-dimensional cutout effect of the subject. This really is a very nice portrait lens. Here's an f2 example. Again, this is using available light, getting a little bit closer. And so IAF has nailed the eyes, no problem there. Eyes look really beautiful, and a very, very, you know, soft defocused background. So great stuff. I'll also note that after the firmware 3.0 update to my A7R Mark III, IAF works better than ever here. And so here, even with glasses, this is available light. You can see that it has managed to just nail where it's supposed to. And I'm really, really impressed with how well IAF works with this lens. And look how, I mean, just nice the colors are. I think skin tones are nice and accurate. Just a really, really nice job there. The other advantage with this update is the addition of Pet IAF, which still doesn't work as well as People IAF, but I will point out this is f1.4, and that's some fabulous, fabulous detail just using the available light in the room. You've probably been able to determine if you've watched through to this point that I'm actually really quite pleased with the image quality out of the Samyang 85mm F1.4 AF lens for Sony. I really feel like they have hit a very nice balance between the sharpness and aberration control And then the absolute rendering from the lens, when it comes down to color rendition, and above all, the bokeh rendering, which in this case has a pretty nice balance between having a very sharp subject, not the sharpest I've seen, not the most corrected that I've seen, but sharp enough, very sharp, while also having a really soft, pleasing background. In some ways, it is most similar to the Canon 85mm F1.4 LIS lens. Actually, the Samyang has less aberrations than what that lens does. I actually like it a little bit better, I think, but it is, similar to that in that the Canon lens has a nice blend between sharpness and the bokeh rendering. And so this is a really, really nicely performing lens, particularly if you're looking for a portrait lens, which I think is the primary purpose of it. So stay tuned, and I'll give you more information about, in the final verdict, about, kind of the whole package of the autofocus performance. We'll take a look at video performance, how video tracking does, all of those different aspects. And then where I think the focus system excels and where I think that it still needs a little bit of tweaking. I'll have all of that and more in the final verdict, so stay tuned. In the meantime, take a look in the description down below. I'm taking lots of photos with this particular lens. It's one that I'm personally interested in, and so take a look at what I have been getting. I'm struggling to find good stuff to shoot, even though it's really quite bland outside right now. But despite that, I think the lens is doing pretty good under the circumstance. So you can take a look at that. There's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. And if you're interested in the lens, I would recommend going ahead and pre-ordering it right now. The buzz out there from what I'm seeing and what others are seeing says that this is probably going to be a pretty popular lens. And so if you'd like to get your hands on one, getting a pre-order in is probably a good idea. You can also follow me on social media, including now on Instagram. Become a patron and help support what I'm doing. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.